You don't belong here." The words landed cold, sharp enough to cut through the quiet evening air as Officer Daniel Hayes stepped forward, his badge catching the glow of the streetlights like it was the only thing that mattered in that moment. And across from him stood Naomi Carter, still as stone, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unreadable in a way that made people uneasy without knowing why. Because it wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was something else entirely, something controlled, something deliberate. And yet to Daniel, she was just another face that didn't fit his idea of who belonged in a neighborhood like this. A quiet upscale block lined with townhomes and polished black SUVs parked neatly along the curb. The kind of place where silence carried weight, and every glance felt like a judgment waiting to be spoken. And still, Naomi said nothing, not when he questioned her presence, not when his tone sharpened, not even when the small crowd began to gather at a distance, drawn in by the tension that hummed in the air like a warning no one could quite hear, because she wasn't reacting the way people expected, and that unsettled him more than anything. The way she held his gaze without flinching, without rushing to explain herself, without lowering her eyes, as if she knew something he didn't, as if this moment, this exact confrontation, had already played out somewhere in her mind, and she was simply waiting for it to catch up to reality, and Daniel mistook that silence for defiance. The kind he thought he'd seen 100 times before, the kind he believed he knew how to handle, his voice rising just enough to make sure everyone nearby could hear it, to establish control, to remind the scene who held the authority. But authority has a way of revealing itself in layers, and sometimes the loudest voice in the moment isn't the one that carries the most power. Sometimes it's the quiet one, the one that waits, the one that doesn't need to prove anything because it already knows. And Naomi Carter stood there, calm, steady, watching every move, every word, every assumption being made about her. And somewhere beneath the surface of that stillness, something was shifting, something invisible, something already in motion long before Daniel Hayes ever decided to step in front of her and say those 5 words that would change everything. Because what he saw in front of him was a woman he thought he could control, but what he failed to see was the truth standing right there in plain sight, waiting patiently for the moment when it would no longer need permission to be heard. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching between them like something alive as Naomi Carter shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough movement to show she was present, aware, and completely unshaken by the tension building around her. And that was the moment when the atmosphere began to change in a way no one could quite explain, because while Officer Daniel Hayes continued speaking, his words sharper now, more insistent, trying to fill the space she refused to occupy with fear, there was something else happening beneath the surface, something quieter, something far more controlled, the kind of shift you do not notice until it is already too late to stop it. And somewhere down the street, out of sight but not out of reach, a black SUV idled for a fraction longer than necessary before its headlights dimmed slightly. A subtle signal that would have meant nothing to anyone else, but everything to the right set of eyes, and Naomi's gaze flickered for just a second, not toward the vehicle, not toward anything obvious, but inward, as if confirming a sequence already set in motion, because this was never just a random stop, never just an unfortunate moment of misunderstanding. This was timing, precision, layers unfolding exactly as they were meant to, and Daniel could feel something slipping even if he could not name it. The way his voice echoed back at him without the reaction he expected, the way the small crowd watching from a distance had grown quieter instead of louder, their curiosity shifting into something more cautious, more uncertain, as if they too could sense that this situation was not what it appeared to be. And still Naomi said nothing, her calm becoming heavier with every passing second, her silence no longer passive but intentional, almost strategic. And that was when Daniel made a decision. The kind of decision people make when they feel control beginning to drift from their hands. He stepped closer, closing the space between them, trying to reassert authority through presence alone. But even that felt different now, because proximity only made one thing clearer. Naomi Carter was not intimidated, not even slightly, her eyes steady, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, as if she had already measured every possible outcome and found none of them threatening. And somewhere behind that stillness, something was already moving, something larger than the moment itself, because across the city, signals were being received, quiet acknowledgments exchanged, doors opening, engines starting, people who did not hesitate because they did not need to ask questions. They already knew the name. They already understood the stakes. And back on that quiet street under the dim glow of American streetlights, Daniel Hayes stood in front of a woman he believed he had figured out, unaware that every second he spent trying to assert control was another second bringing him closer to a truth that would not just challenge his authority, but redefine it completely. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in a moment is not the voice that demands attention, but the one that waits for the exact second when it no longer has to ask for it. There is a moment, right before everything changes, when the world feels like it is holding its breath, and that moment had arrived, settling over the street with a quiet weight that no one could explain, but everyone could feel. As Naomi Carter remained exactly where she stood, her presence no longer just calm but deliberate, almost anchored, as if moving now would disrupt something far more important than the tension unfolding in front of her. And Officer Daniel Hayes felt it too, even if he could not name it. The subtle shift that made his next words come out just a fraction slower. His confidence still there, but no longer as solid as it had been seconds ago. Because control is easy when it is unquestioned, but the second doubt enters the space, even silently, it begins to fracture, and the crowd that had gathered was no longer whispering, no longer exchanging curious glances. Instead, they watched with a stillness that mirrored Naomi's own, as if instinctively recognizing that something larger was about to surface, something that would redefine the moment in ways none of them were prepared for. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision, the kind of precision that does not need attention to be effective, because the first black SUV turned the corner slowly, its movement smooth and intentional, followed by another, and then a third, each one pulling into position with quiet coordination that felt anything but random, and Daniel's eyes flickered toward them, just for a second. But it was enough for the certainty in his posture to shift, enough for the first crack to appear in the control he thought he held. Because this was not how routine situations unfolded. This was not how ordinary nights escalated. And Naomi finally moved, not away, not in retreat, but with a subtle adjustment of her stance as she turned slightly toward the approaching vehicles, her expression unchanged yet somehow more defined, more certain, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. And when the doors opened, the air itself seemed to tighten, not with fear, but with recognition. Because the individuals stepping out were not rushing, not reacting, they were arriving. And there is a difference between those two things, a difference Daniel felt immediately as his voice faltered just enough to betray it. Because authority recognizes authority even before it understands it. And one of the individuals stepped forward, his posture composed, his presence quiet but undeniable. And for the first time since this encounter began, Daniel Hayes hesitated, not fully, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough that the balance of the moment shifted, and Naomi Carter watched it happen without a word, because she did not need to speak to change the direction of what was coming. She never had. And as the distance between her and the approaching figure closed, the truth that had been building beneath the surface was finally beginning to rise, not as a shock, but as an inevitability, because some truths do not explode into existence. They arrive exactly when they are supposed to. And the only question left in that moment was not whether everything was about to change, but how much of what Daniel believed would survive once it did. The man who stepped forward did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not demand attention, and yet the entire street seemed to shift around him, as if something unseen had just taken control of the moment, his shoes barely making a sound against the pavement as he closed the distance with measured steps, his eyes scanning once, taking in Naomi Carter, the officer, the crowd, everything. And in that single glance, there was a level of awareness that felt different from anything Daniel Hayes had encountered before, because this was not curiosity. This was assessment, precise and immediate, and Daniel felt it land on him like a quiet pressure, subtle but undeniable, the kind that makes a person straighten without realizing why. And still he tried to hold his ground, his voice returning, firmer now, but edged with something new, something less certain as he spoke, asking questions that sounded more procedural than authoritative, because somewhere deep down he already sensed that the situation had moved beyond him. that the rules he relied on were no longer the ones in play. And Naomi remained still, her attention shifting now fully toward the man approaching. Her expression unchanged, but her presence somehow sharper, more defined, as if the moment she had anticipated was finally aligning with reality. And when the man stopped a few feet away, he did not look at Daniel first, he looked at her. And there was recognition there, clear and immediate, a silent exchange that passed between them in less than a second, but carried the weight of something far more significant than anything spoken so far. And only after that did his gaze move to Daniel, steady, composed, not confrontational, but not yielding either, and the space between them seemed to tighten, as if the air itself understood that something irreversible was about to be set in motion. And Daniel spoke again, trying to re-establish the boundaries he thought still applied, explaining, justifying, framing the situation in terms he was used to controlling, but the words felt different now, thinner somehow, as if they no longer held the same authority they had moments ago. And the man listened without interrupting, without reacting, simply allowing the explanation to finish as if it were a formality that needed to be completed before the real conversation could begin. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying no urgency and no need to raise itself above the silence that had settled over the street. And in that calmness there was something far more powerful than volume, something that did not push but simply existed, and that existence alone began to shift the balance completely, because authority does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly and lets everything else reveal its limits first. And Naomi Carter stood there at the center of it all, no longer just a participant in the moment, but the axis around which it was turning. And as the man reached into his jacket with a deliberate, unhurried motion, Daniel Hayes felt something inside him tighten, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable awareness that whatever came next would not be something he could control. And for the first time since this began, he was no longer certain of his place in the scene unfolding around him, because the moment he thought he understood had already moved beyond him, and the truth he had overlooked was no longer waiting in silence. It was about to step forward. The motion was simple, almost unremarkable, but it carried a weight that shifted everything as the man slowly pulled a slim identification case from inside his jacket, his movements precise and unhurried, as if time itself had adjusted to follow his pace rather than the other way around. And for a brief second no one spoke, no one moved, because instinct told them this was not just another exchange, this was a line being drawn. And when the case opened, it was not flashed aggressively, not forced into view, it was presented calmly, deliberately, held at a level where it could not be ignored. And Daniel Hayes leaned forward just slightly, enough to read, enough to recognize. And in that instant something inside him shifted in a way he could not hide, not fully, because recognition does not ask for permission before it shows itself. It simply arrives, clear and undeniable. And the words printed on that identification were not loud, they did not need to be, but they carried authority that extended far beyond the street, beyond the city, beyond anything Daniel had prepared for in a moment like this. And his posture changed, subtly but completely, the edge in his stance softening into something more cautious, more measured, as if he was suddenly aware that every move from this point forward mattered in a way it had not just seconds ago. And the man closed the case with the same calm precision, slipping it back into his jacket without breaking eye contact. Because the message had already been delivered, it did not need to be repeated. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not empty, but full of understanding that was settling into place piece by piece. And Naomi Carter finally moved, not in reaction, but in alignment, stepping forward just enough to stand beside the man rather than across from him. A small shift in position that changed the entire structure of the moment, because now the lines were clear even if nothing had been said out loud. And Daniel's voice, when it came, was different, still controlled, still professional, but no longer certain in the way it had been before, his words more careful, his tone more restrained, as if he was trying to navigate something he had not expected to encounter. And Naomi watched him with the same steady gaze, her silence no longer a question but an answer that had been waiting all along. And somewhere in the background, the presence of the other vehicles, the other individuals who had stepped out, remained constant, not intervening, not escalating, simply existing as a quiet confirmation that this moment extended far beyond a single conversation on a quiet street. And Daniel could feel it now, the scope of it. The realization that this was not just about one decision or one interaction, but something larger, something already in motion before he ever arrived. And for the first time, he began to understand that the woman in front of him had never been uncertain, never been out of place. It was his perception that had been incomplete, his assumptions that had filled in gaps that were never his to define. And as that realization settled, slow but undeniable, the balance of power shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through truth revealing itself exactly when it was meant to. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, calm, composed, no longer waiting, because the moment she had anticipated had finally arrived, and there was nothing left to interrupt what came next. It did not happen all at once, not in a dramatic burst or a loud declaration, but in a quiet unraveling that began the moment Daniel Hayes realized he was no longer leading the situation, because authority had shifted without asking for his permission, and now every word he chose carried weight he could not fully control, his voice steady but slower, more deliberate, as if each sentence had to pass through a filter that had not existed before. And Naomi Carter remained composed beside the man. Her presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, simply acknowledged in a way that changed everything without a single command being spoken. And the street that once felt like Daniel's domain now felt unfamiliar, as if the ground itself had tilted just enough to throw off his sense of direction. And he glanced briefly at the gathered vehicles, at the individuals who stood near them, not intervening but clearly not incidental, their stillness more powerful than movement, because they were not reacting. They were prepared, and that distinction settled heavily into Daniel's awareness as he tried to recalibrate, to find a position that still made sense within this new structure. But the more he adjusted, the more it became clear that the framework he relied on no longer applied. And Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying no trace of urgency or frustration, yet it landed with a clarity that cut through everything that had come before, not because it was louder, but because it was certain, and certainty has a way of reshaping a moment more effectively than force ever could. And she did not raise her voice, did not step forward aggressively. She simply stated what needed to be understood, and in doing so she revealed just enough to confirm what the man beside her had already implied, that this situation extended far beyond a routine encounter, that it was connected to something larger, something structured, something already in motion long before Daniel had made his assumptions. And as her words settled, the air seemed to shift again, not tightening this time, but clarifying, as if the uncertainty that had lingered was being replaced by a reality that could no longer be ignored. And Daniel felt it fully now, the recognition that this was not a moment he could redirect, not a narrative he could reshape, because the truth was no longer waiting beneath the surface. It was present, visible, undeniable, and for the first time he saw Naomi Carter not as someone he needed to question, but as someone he needed to understand. And that shift in perception, quiet as it was, marked the point where everything changed, because once the truth is recognized, even silently, it cannot be undone. And Naomi stood there, steady and unshaken, no longer waiting for the moment to arrive, because it had already begun, and whatever came next would not be determined by assumption, but by reality unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The words did not echo, they settled, and that made them more powerful, because once Naomi Carter spoke, the moment no longer belonged to uncertainty, it belonged to clarity, and clarity has a way of exposing everything that once hid behind assumption. And Daniel Hayes felt that exposure in a way he could not ignore, not because anyone raised their voice or forced the shift, but because the structure he had relied on had quietly dissolved, leaving him standing in a reality that no longer aligned with what he believed just minutes ago. And he tried to respond, tried to reframe, but the rhythm of the conversation had changed. It was no longer reactive. It was controlled, deliberate, and he was no longer the one setting the pace. And Naomi did not need to repeat herself, did not need to expand on what she had already made clear, because the people around her, the presence that had arrived without urgency but with precision, had already confirmed everything that mattered. And the man beside her stepped slightly forward, not to dominate the space, but to reinforce it, his presence acting as a quiet boundary that did not need to be explained, and Daniel noticed it immediately. The way the distance between them now felt intentional, measured, as if every inch had meaning, and he adjusted his stance again, not out of instruction, but instinct, because something inside him understood that the rules had changed, and across the street, the onlookers remained still, their earlier curiosity replaced with a silent recognition that this was no longer something to interpret casually. This was something unfolding with purpose. And Naomi's gaze moved briefly across the scene, taking in every detail, every reaction, not with concern, but with awareness, the kind that comes from someone who has seen moments like this before, moments where truth arrives quietly and lets everything else fall into place around it. And Daniel finally paused, his words stopping not because he had nothing to say, but because he realized that saying more would not restore what had already shifted. And in that pause, in that brief silence where no one rushed to fill the space, something deeper settled in, something heavier than tension. It was understanding, the slow realization that this was not about proving anything anymore. It was about acknowledging what was already true, and Naomi Carter stood there, composed and steady, not asserting dominance, not demanding recognition, simply existing in a way that made everything else adjust around her. And that was the moment Daniel Hayes understood something he had not considered before. That power does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives with certainty, and once it is recognized, even quietly, there is no returning to what came before, because the moment has already changed. And the truth that defines it is no longer waiting to be revealed. It is already here. For a moment it felt like everything had settled, like the scene had reached its natural conclusion, and that illusion was exactly what made it dangerous. Because moments like this rarely end where people think they do. They only appear to pause while something deeper continues to unfold, and Daniel Hayes stood there holding on to that pause, trying to interpret it as resolution, trying to convince himself that the shift he felt was contained within the street, within the night, within something manageable. But Naomi Carter already understood what he was only beginning to sense, that this was not closure, this was transition, the point where surface reality gives way to what has been moving underneath all along. And as if in quiet confirmation, one of the individuals near the vehicles stepped slightly forward, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention, holding a tablet that had not been visible before, its screen casting a faint glow that contrasted with the dim streetlights. And the man beside Naomi acknowledged it with a subtle nod, the kind of communication that required no words because everything had already been anticipated, and Daniel's attention shifted toward it instinctively, drawn not by curiosity, but by something deeper, a recognition that whatever was on that screen mattered in a way he could not ignore. And when the tablet was turned just enough for him to see, it was not a dramatic reveal, not a spectacle, just information presented clearly, calmly, yet carrying a weight that made everything else fade for a second, because what he saw was not just about the present moment. It reached backward, connecting dots he had never considered, timelines, records, patterns, small decisions layered over time, forming something far more significant than any single encounter. And his breath slowed, not out of fear, but out of realization, the kind that settles in quietly and refuses to leave. And Naomi watched him process it without interruption, her expression steady, because this was not about catching him off guard. This was about letting him see, truly see, the difference between assumption and reality. And the street around them remained still, almost respectfully so, as if even the environment understood that something important was unfolding, something that extended beyond what anyone had initially witnessed. And Daniel's posture shifted again, not collapsing, not retreating, but adjusting to a truth that was now impossible to dismiss. And for the first time, he did not try to speak immediately. He did not rush to respond, because he knew now that words would not restore what had already changed. And Naomi Carter stood there, composed and grounded, not asserting dominance, not seeking reaction, simply allowing the moment to reach its full weight. Because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from what is done, but from what is revealed. And as Daniel Hayes stood in that realization, one thing became clear in a way it never had before. This was never just about a single decision on a quiet street. It was about everything that decision represented, And what came next would not be about correcting a moment, it would be about answering for it. The weight of what he had just seen did not fade. It expanded, settling into every corner of Daniel Hayes's awareness as the quiet glow of the tablet screen dimmed and was lowered again, not hidden, not emphasized, simply removed from focus because it had already done what it needed to do. And in its absence, the reality it revealed remained, clearer now than anything else in the moment. And Daniel stood there absorbing it piece by piece, not resisting, not denying, but recalculating, because what he had believed to be a contained situation had now stretched far beyond his reach, connecting to layers he had never considered, systems he had never interacted with, decisions that carried consequences far beyond a single night. And Naomi Carter watched that realization unfold without interruption, her presence steady, not pressing, not judging, simply allowing the truth to settle at its own pace. Because she understood something that Daniel was only beginning to grasp, that once awareness arrives, it cannot be rushed or forced, it must be absorbed, and in that absorption comes the shift that changes everything. And the man beside her spoke again, not to escalate, not to accuse, but to clarify, his voice calm, measured, outlining next steps in a way that felt less like instruction and more like inevitability, because what had been set in motion was no longer optional. It was already moving forward, and Daniel listened, truly listened this time, not searching for gaps, not preparing a response, but taking in each word with the understanding that this was no longer about control. It was about alignment with a reality that had already taken shape, and the street around them seemed to reflect that shift, the earlier tension replaced with a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the moment itself had settled into a new structure, one where everything was exactly where it needed to be. And Naomi took a small step forward, not toward Daniel, not away from him, but into the center of the space that now belonged to truth rather than assumption, her movement subtle yet definitive. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty, but this time there was something more in it, not force, not authority in the traditional sense, but clarity, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. And Daniel felt it fully, the final piece falling into place, the realization that this moment was not just a turning point, it was a boundary. The line between what had been assumed and what was now known, and once crossed, there was no returning to the version of events that existed before. And he exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because what stood in front of him was not a challenge to overcome, it was a truth to acknowledge. And Naomi Carter remained steady, grounded in that truth, not needing to assert it because it was already present, already shaping everything around it. And as the man beside her concluded his explanation, the direction of what would follow became clear without needing to be stated outright, because some outcomes do not require announcement. They unfold naturally once the reality behind them is understood, and Daniel Hayes stood there at that exact point, no longer questioning what was happening, no longer trying to redirect it, but fully aware that whatever came next would not be decided by him. And that awareness, quiet as it was, marked the true shift in the moment, the point where control gave way to consequence. And the story that had begun on this quiet street was now moving into something far larger than anyone watching could have predicted. By the time the explanation ended, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was decisive, the kind of silence that marks the exact moment when everything has already been determined, even if nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. And Daniel Hayes felt it settle around him like something he could not step out of, not because anyone forced him to stay, but because the reality in front of him had closed every path he thought he had just minutes earlier. And for a brief second he looked around, not searching for escape, but for confirmation, and what he saw reflected the same truth from every angle. The still figures near the vehicles, the quiet attention of the crowd, the steady presence of the man beside Naomi Carter, all of it aligned in a way that left no room for interpretation. And Naomi herself stood unchanged, her posture calm, her gaze steady, not focused on asserting control, not demanding acknowledgement, but simply existing within the authority she had never needed to prove. And that was the moment Daniel understood something deeper than the situation itself. That power does not always arrive to challenge you. Sometimes it arrives to reveal where you have been standing all along. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing not out of comfort, but out of recognition. Because resisting now would not change anything. It would only delay what was already set in motion. And the man beside Naomi gave a slight nod, not as a command, but as a signal that the next phase had already begun. And with that, movement returned to the scene, subtle at first, coordinated without urgency, as if every step had been planned long before anyone else realized this moment would happen. And Daniel remained still for just a second longer, absorbing the final shift, the quiet, understanding that this was no longer about what had happened on this street, but about what that moment represented in a much larger system. And Naomi took one step forward, not to close distance, not to dominate the space, but to move with the flow of what had already been established, her presence guiding the direction without force, without resistance, because she did not need to lead in the way people expect. The situation itself was already aligned with her, and Daniel followed, not because he was told to, but because there was no other direction left that made sense. And as he moved, the weight of the moment did not lift, it transformed, shifting from confrontation into consequence, from uncertainty into clarity. And for the first time since this began, everything felt settled in a way that could not be undone, because the truth had not only been revealed, it had taken its place at the center of the moment, and nothing else could exist there anymore. The movement away from the street did not feel like an ending. It felt like a transition into something more defined, more structured, as the quiet hum of engines and soft footsteps replaced the tension that had once filled the air, and Daniel Hayes walked within that shift with a new awareness settling deeper into him with every step, not forced, not rushed, but undeniable. Because the further he moved from the moment where he had spoken with certainty, the clearer it became how incomplete that certainty had been. And Naomi Carter walked just ahead, not leading in the traditional sense, not turning to check who followed, because she did not need to. Her presence alone set the direction, steady and grounded in a way that made everything around her align without effort. And the individuals accompanying her moved with the same quiet precision. No raised voices, no unnecessary gestures. Just coordination that spoke of preparation long before this moment had ever occurred. And Daniel noticed it now in ways he had not before. The way doors opened before they were reached, the way information seemed to flow without being spoken, the way every detail fit into place as if guided by something larger than any one person. And that realization settled into him with a weight that was not overwhelming, but clarifying, because it replaced assumption with understanding. And understanding does not rush, it builds, piece by piece, until there is no space left for doubt. And Naomi paused for a brief second near one of the vehicles, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge something communicated quietly between her and the man beside her. A glance, a nod, a confirmation that required no explanation, and Daniel stood just behind, observing, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone beginning to recognize the structure unfolding around him. And when Naomi turned slightly, her gaze met his for the first time since they had begun moving, not confrontational, not questioning, but steady, as if offering something without needing to say it, and understanding that this moment was not about conflict anymore, it was about consequence. And consequence carries its own form of clarity, the kind that does not punish for the sake of it, but reveals what has already been set in motion. And Daniel felt that clarity settle fully, not as a sudden realization, but as the final piece of something that had been building since the first word he spoke earlier that night. And as Naomi turned forward again and stepped into the vehicle, the scene behind them remained quiet, unchanged on the surface yet entirely different in meaning. Because what had taken place, there was no longer just an isolated interaction. It had become part of something larger, something that would continue long after the street returned to its usual stillness. And Daniel paused for a fraction of a second before following, not out of uncertainty, but to take in the last moment of the space where everything had shifted. And in that pause, he understood something he had not before, that the most powerful changes do not always happen in the loudest moments. Sometimes they happen in the quiet ones, the ones where truth steps forward, without force, and everything else simply adjusts around it. And as he moved again, stepping into what came next, there was no question left about what this moment had become. It was no longer about what he thought he knew. It was about what had now been made clear, and that clarity would not fade when the night ended. It would carry forward, shaping everything that followed. By the time the door closed behind them, the night outside had already begun to return to its quiet rhythm, as if nothing had happened, as if the street had not just witnessed a moment that would ripple far beyond its narrow stretch of pavement. And inside, the silence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, like everything had finally aligned with a truth that had been waiting patiently to take its place. And Daniel Hayes sat with that realization, not resisting it anymore, not trying to reshape it, but allowing it to exist fully, because there was no version of events left where his earlier assumptions could stand. They had already been replaced by something clearer, something more complete, and across from him, Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been from the start, composed, steady, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply present in a way that made everything else fall into perspective. And for the first time since this began, Daniel understood that this was never about proving a point. It was about revealing one, the kind that does not rely on volume or confrontation, but on patience and certainty. And as the vehicle moved through the quiet city streets, passing familiar landmarks that now felt slightly different, slightly smaller in the context of what he had just experienced, he realized that the moment on that street had not been an interruption in his routine. It had been a mirror, reflecting something deeper than the situation itself. Something about perception, about assumption, about the quiet ways people decide what belongs and what does not. And Naomi's voice, when it came again, was calm, measured, carrying no judgment, yet it held a weight that settled deeper than anything spoken before, not because it was meant to challenge him, but because it did not need to. It simply stated what had already been made clear, that truth does not need to fight for space. It only needs to be seen, and once it is, everything else adjusts around it whether we are ready or not. And Daniel listened, truly listened, not as an officer trying to respond, but as a person recognizing something he could not ignore. And in that recognition, something shifted quietly within him, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to change how he would see the next moment, and the one after that. And as the city lights moved past the window in steady lines, the weight of the night did not feel like something closing in. It felt like something opening, a space where understanding had replaced assumption, where clarity had taken the place of certainty that was never complete. And Naomi Carter looked ahead, her gaze steady, not looking back at what had already passed, because she understood what Daniel was only beginning to learn, that the most powerful form of justice is not the one that shouts the loudest, but the one that arrives quietly and leaves no room for anything but truth. And as the vehicle continued forward into the night, one thing remained clear, the moment on. That street was never about who held power in that instant. It was about who understood it, because power can be worn, it can be displayed, it can be assumed, but in the end, it is truth that defines it. And that night, truth did not need to announce itself. It simply stood still and waited to be seen.